Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are going straight to the source, pulling back the curtain on one of the most structurally complex areas in all of human development.
Absolutely. We're talking about the formation of the urinary and reproductive tracts.
And for that, we're diving into Chapter 22 of Gray's Anatomy, the developmental blueprint of the urogenital system.
It's a fascinating story. It's all about constant remodeling, structures that appear and then disappear, and some really critical hormonal signals.
So our mission today is to give you a rapid, clear, and hopefully a very visual tour. We want you to be able to mentally picture all these processes, the budding, the fusion, the descent.
Without needing to stare at a confusing diagram.
Exactly. If you can picture the start and the finish, we've done our job.
Okay, so to begin, we have to establish the origin. Where does all this start?
Right.
It all begins with a specific group of cells called the intermediate mesenchyme. This is tissue sitting high up on the posterior wall of the embryonic culum.
And this starts happening really early, right? Around stage 11, so maybe 29, 30 days post-conception.
That's it. And this tissue thickens and forms this long vertical structure called the urogenital ridge.
And that ridge is basically the birthplace for everything.
Everything. The kidneys, the gonads, the suprarenal glands, all the ducts. They all emerge from this master tissue, moving sequentially from the head end down toward the tail.
Okay, let's unpack that first major sequence. It feels like a three-act play for kidney development. You've got the pronephros, mesonephros, and metanephros.
It is. It's like watching evolution play out over a few weeks.
So what's the fundamental takeaway here? What do we need to remember about this succession?
The main thing is that this is a classic temporal and spatial succession. They appear, they do their thing, and then they mostly regress in order from cranial to caudal.
But only the last one sticks around.
Only the third and final system, the metanephros, is retained. That becomes our permanent, functional adult kidney.
The pronephros always sounds like a developmental footnote in humans. It's barely there, isn't it?
Functionally, yes. It's just some rudimentary cell clusters at the very top of the ridge. It appears, and then almost immediately, it's gone.
So it never actually filters anything.
Never forms functional glomeruli in humans, no. It just sort of sets the stage. But it never takes a bow.
Okay, so then the mesonephros, or the Wolffian body, takes the stage. Now this one is significant.
Very significant, not just because it's functional for a while, but because of what it leaves behind.
So when does it show up?
Around stage 12, it forms this big body with, maybe 70 to 80 tubules in total. But, and this is a crucial visualization point, they develop and atrophy at the same time.
Ah, so the oldest ones at the top are already degenerating while new ones are still forming at the bottom.
Precisely. You never actually have 80 fully formed tubules at once, maybe 30 or 40 at most.
But it does work for a time. It produces urine.
It does, by stage 17.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a very simple, linear system. It can only produce hypotonic urine, so not very concentrated.
And its most important legacy is the duct.
The mesonephric duct, that's the key. That duct has to stick around because the permanent kidney, the metanephros, doesn't just continue from the mesonephros.
It's a whole new project.
A completely new project. It buds off that mesonephric duct system. It's a total switch in organizational strategy.
All right, let's focus on that permanent kidney then, the metanephros. To picture this thing building itself, what are the two essential structures we need to see?
It's what I like to call a developmental handshake. First, you have the ureteric bud. Think of it as a little outgrowth from the bottom of that mesonephric duct.
Okay, a little bud. And second?
Second, you have the metanephric blastema, which is just a dense clump of that original intermediate mesenchyme sitting right next to where the bud emerges.
So the bud grows into the blastema.
Exactly, and that interaction is everything. The ureteric bud becomes the template for the whole collecting system. It just branches and branches dichotomously.
Forking over and over.
Over and over again. The initial stalk becomes the ureter, the branches become the renal pelvis, the calyces, and all the collecting ducts.
So that's the plumbing. What about the actual filtering units, the nephrons?
That's the blastema's job. The mesenchyme around each tip of the branching bud gets an instruction, and it converts into epithelial tissue.
And it makes these really specific shapes, right?
It's a beautiful sequence. The cells form tight little balls, then they become comma-shaped, then they morph into these S-shaped bodies.
And that S shape is the key.
That's the key, because that S shape elongates into the incredibly efficient loop of Henle.
Which allows the metanephros to do something the mesonephros couldn't.
Right. It sets up the countercurrent exchange mechanism. This is what lets us conserve water and produce hypertonic urine, highly concentrated. A massive functional upgrade.
And while all this intricate architecture is being built, the kidney itself is on the move.
It is. It doesn't stay put. You have to picture it starting way down low in the sacral region.
And it ascends.
It's more of a relative ascent. The embryo's body is growing and straining so fast, the kidney appears to move up cranially, and as it moves, it keeps tapping into new arteries for blood.
So it gets temporary blood vessels from the common iliac arteries, things like that.
For example, yes, and it just keeps switching until it reaches its final position.
Which explains why accessory renal arteries are so common. Those early arteries sometimes just stick around.
A classic anatomical correlation. The definitive renal artery is just the last one it connects to, a persistent mesonephric artery that stays put once the ascent stops.
Okay, before we move on, let's touch on a huge clinical point. Nephron creation isn't infinite. When does it stop?
It starts right around postmenstrual week 38, near full term. And that timing has profound implications, especially for preterm infants.
Because they're born before the factory has finished its run.
Exactly. The very last nephrons to form are in the outermost cortex. They're still immature if a baby is born early. The sudden shift to life outside the womb, the oxygen, the metabolic demands, that can actually halt their development.
And that condition has a name.
Oligonephropathy. It literally means fewer than the normal number of nephrons, and it can predispose that individual to kidney problems later in life.
Okay, so we have a permanent kidney.
Blah.
But moving down the axis, the next big problem is separation. The lower end of the embryo has to separate the digestive, urinary, and reproductive plumbing.
It all starts with the cloaca.
Which is just one big common chamber at first.
Right. It's the hindgut and the allantois all emptying into one space. The key to separating them is the urorectal septum.
Okay, what's that?
Picture a thick curtain of tissue that starts growing downwards, or caudally, right toward the outer body wall.
And it just divides that chamber in two.
Precisely. Dorsally, you get the future rectum. Ventrally, you get this big cavity called the urogenital sinus.
And the upper part of that sinus is what becomes the bladder.
The urinary bladder, correct.
So how do the ureters, which we know butted off the mesonephric ducts, get their own entry point into this new bladder?
It's a really dynamic process. Initially, the ureter and the mesonephric duct share an opening. But as the bladder wall expands, it sort of pulls the ureter's opening with it, moving it up and out to the side.
So they get their own separate entrances.
They get their own separate entrances, while the mesonephric duct opening migrates down into the urethra in males.
Okay, this brings us to one of those big updates in anatomy. The trigone, the floor of the bladder.
Ah, yes.
The old thinking was that its lining was mesodermal, that it was pulled in from the mesonephric ducts.
That was a textbook view for decades, but modern developmental biology has completely clarified this. The epithelium of the trigone is now confirmed to be endodermal.
So it's from the urogenital sinus, just like the rest of the bladder lining.
Exactly. It simplifies things. The entire lining is derived from endoderm.
You know, just above the kidneys, we have the suprarenal glands, the adrenals. Their development is different, a dual origin.
Completely different. The outer layer, the cortex, comes from the colotomic epithelium of that same urogenital ridge. But the inner core, the medulla, that's formed by neural crest cells.
These amazing cells that migrate all over the embryo.
They invade the developing cortex to form the medulla.
What's always surprising is just how big they are in the fetus.
They're massive. At some stages, the suprarenal gland is visibly larger than the kidney next to it.
Wow.
And that bulk is mostly the fetal cortex. This huge cortex then shrinks rapidly. It undergoes involution right after birth, a process that's really kicked off by parturition itself.
Which connects directly to a key clinical issue, congenital adrenal hyperplasia.
Right. Often it's a deficiency in an enzyme, 21-hydroxylase. Without it, you can't make cortisol properly.
And the raw materials get shunted down another pathway.
A pathway that leads to a massive overproduction of androgens. In a female fetus, that androgen excess can cause significant masculinization of the external genitalia. It's a perfect example of how one endocrine problem can dramatically affect a completely different system. So now we can shift focus to the reproductive tract, which gets going about 10 days later than the urinary system.
And we start at this indifferent or ambisexual stage. Stage 16 is not yet male or female.
Correct. The gonadal ridge forms on the inner side of the mesonephros. It's got the epithelium, the mesenchyme, and crucially, the primordial germ cells.
And these cells are the key, right? They're travelers.
They are. They migrate all the way from the yolk sac to colonize this ridge. Without them, you cannot form a functional gonad, period.
And running right alongside this indifferent gonad, we have the two rival duct systems.
Everyone starts with both. You have the mesonephric duct, which is also called the Wolffian duct, and the paramesonephric duct, or the Müllerian duct.
And differentiation is basically a duel to see which one persists.
A hormonally driven dual, yes.
So if female development is the anatomical default, what's the active ingredient needed to push the system toward male?
The active ingredient is the Y chromosome, specifically a gene on it called the SRY gene.
The master switch.
It is the master switch. SRY's job is to tell the supporting cells in that indifferent gonad to become Sertoli cells. That is the first key step to making a testes, and it actively shuts down the female pathway.
Once that testis is formed, its hormones dictate the fate of the ducts.
It's a two-part instruction set. First, those Sertoli cells produce Anti-Müllerian Hormone, or AMH.
And, as the name implies,
It causes the Müllerian, or paramesonephric ducts to regress completely. They just disappear. Second, the leading cells in the testes make testosterone.
and that's the signal to keep the other ducts.
Exactly. Testosterone promotes the mesonephric, or Wolffian ducts, to persist and differentiate into the entire male duct system. The epididymis, the ductus deferens, seminal glands, all of it.
And conversely, if there's no SRY gene, there's no AMH, no testosterone, so the default female path just continues.
The default continues. Without AMH, the paramesonephric ducts persist. They fuse in the middle to form the uterus and cervix. Their upper parts stay separate as the uterine tubes.
And the male ducts.
The mesonephric ducts without testosterone just regress, leaving only tiny remnants.
Okay, let's finish with the external genitalia. We start indifferent again. A genital tubercle, genital folds, labioscrotal swellings. How does the male form a penis and includes the urethra?
Androgens are the driver. The genital tubercle enlarges. But the crucial step is the fusion of the genital folds. They zip up from back to front, enclosing the urethral groove.
Creating the spongy urethra and that seam on the underside, the median rafe.
Exactly. And the fascinating update here is that we now know the entire human penile urethra is derived from the endodermal urethral plate. The old idea that the tip was formed by ectoderm has been overridden.
And for the female, it's less about fusion and more about separation.
Correct. The tubercle becomes the clitoris. The genital folds stay separate as the labia minora. The labioscrotal swellings stay separate as the labia majora. And the urogenital sinus stays open as the vestibule.
The final major sequence is descent. This sounds simple, but for the testes, it's a really complex two-phase hormone-driven journey.
It's a very choreographed two-step process. Phase 1 is transabdominal descent.
Okay.
The testes is anchored by a thick cord called the gubernaculum, and the key hormone here is INSL3.
INSL3.
Insulin-like factor 3. It's made by the Leydig cells, and it causes the gubernaculum to swell up, anchoring the testes near the future inguinal canal while the rest of the abdomen grows around it.
So basically holds it in position at the gate. Then phase 2 is the actual passage.
Phase 2 is inguinoscrotal descent. This part is driven by androgens. Starting around week 25 to 35, the gubernaculum elongates and basically guides the testis down through the inguinal canal and into the scrotum.
And ovarian descent is a much quieter affair.
Much quieter. It's largely a relative movement. The ovaries end up staying in the pelvis. The female gubernaculum exists, but without all that INSL3 and androgen, it just transforms into the ovarian ligament and the round ligament of the uterus.
The failure of phase 2 gives us one of the most common clinical anomalies here, cryptorchidism.
Cryptorchidism, or undescended testis. It's highly prevalent. A significant percentage of newborn males.
And it's now seen as part of a bigger picture.
Right. It's classified as a major symptom of testicular dysgenesis syndrome, or TDS. This links undescended tests to other issues like hypospadias, infertility, and a higher risk for testicular cancer.
And the reason for urgent treatment is temperature.
It's all about temperature. The precursor sperm cells, the spermatogonia, they degenerate at core body temperature. So early surgical correction, orchidopexy, ideally between 6 and 9 months, is crucial to get the testes into the cooler scrotum and preserve future fertility.
And finally, just to circle back to the hormones, there's that brief hormonal surge right after birth.
The mini-puberty of infancy. For the first 6 months, the hormonal axis briefly wakes up.
What does that do?
In males, it causes a burst of Sertoli cell proliferation, which might set the upper limit for adult sperm production. In females, you see some transient estrogen effects, follicle maturation, and then atresia. It's like a final early organizational step long before true puberty begins. So to really consolidate this whole journey from chapter 22, let's just remember 3 core themes. First, everything starts from that singular origin, the intermediate mesenchyme.
Forming the urogenital ridge.
Second, that crucial functional shift. from the simple mesonephros making hypotonic urine to the complex metanephros making hypertonic urine, all thanks to those S-shaped nephrons.
And third, the entire reproductive tract structure hinges on an active, aggressive hormonal signal. SRY triggers the testes,
Which makes AMH to get rid of the default female ducts and testosterone to build up the male duct system.
It's a stunning example of hormonal orchestration.
It truly is.
So here's the final provocative thought for you to chew on. Considering the sheer number of hormones, receptors, and transcription factors required, from SRY to INSL3, and the critical timing of those releases, what does the source material imply about how often genetic markers and anatomical presentation might diverge during those tight early hormonal windows?
It's a profound thought.
It really highlights why the resulting spectrum of conditions, what we now call disorders of sex development, is so common. It shows just how delicate that initial architectural plan really is.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us for this in-depth walkthrough of the urogenital blueprint. Consolidate this knowledge, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.